Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 10th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Karen Aram and David Green. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we referred to, and further comments from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's Friday in the 10th week of 2015. The moon is full, and what the late Hunter Thompson called bad craziness stalks the land. It's the Feast of Purim. That's, I understand, in cities without walls in the 10th century. Cities with walls in the 10th century celebrate it later, therefore Jerusalem doesn't celebrate Purim till next week, I'm told. In any case, Purim is a Jewish holiday that commemorates the deliverance of the Jewish people in the ancient Persian Empire, Iran, where a plot had been formed to destroy them. The story is recorded in the biblical book of Esther, the Megillah Esther, scroll of Esther. The royal vizier to King Xerxes of Persia, Haman, planned to kill all the Jews in the empire, but his plans were foiled by Mordecai and his cousin and adopted daughter Esther, who had become queen of Persia. Purim in Israel is perhaps one of the most spectacular holidays in the Mediterranean, like Carnival in Venice, which it looks in some ways influenced by. People take to the streets in costumes made for the holiday. Costumes at Purim are in fact a substantial industry in Israel. And I think the costumes find their way to Venice too, from what I can tell from Carnival. A Purim spiel from Eastern Europe was historically a comic dramatization that attempted to convey the saga of the Purim story. By the 18th century, and by the way, it has some connections apparently with Commedia dell'arte in Italy. By the 18th century, in some parts of Eastern Europe, the Purim plays had evolved into broad-ranging satires with music and dance for which the story of Esther was a pretext. Today, Purim spiels can revolve around anything relating to Jews and Judaism and comic relief to an audience celebrating the holiday. I think that explains what we saw in Washington last week. A new clown appeared in Washington, the Prime Minister of Israel, in the costume of a mass murderer, and presented a Megillah, an actual Megillah, a translation of the book of Esther, to an even greater mass murderer, the President of the United States, as he urged the U.S. to attack Iran. It's not an accident that Karl Marx, in his most explicitly political writing, the 18th Brumaire, talking about politics in the mid-19th century, remarked on the succession of tragedy and farce in events that resembled one another in history. The Iranian foreign minister, incidentally, this week, who seems to know both the history and the contemporary politics, to say nothing of the Hebrew Bible, pointed out that Prime Minister Netanyahu's plea to America to stop the attack on Jews, the extermination of Jews by Iran, rank fantasy, of course, but that the plea of the Israeli Prime Minister neglected the fact that in the story that he referred to, the Book of Esther, it's in fact the king of Iran, the king of Persia, the government of Persia, that prevents the attack on the Jews. Well, we'll talk about what the Prime Minister of Israel was up to, and some other dangerous war policies the United States government tonight. Meanwhile, what I've tried carefully to learn to say, Hag Sameach, happy holiday, happy Purim to one and all, and we'll begin with David Green's celebration of the event.
Thanks. If one reads the Book of Esther or even the Wikipedia entry about the Book of Esther, one will find out that the events that led up to this began with 180 days of drinking. And
Exactly.
on unofficial, this being the unofficial day, we can see that, there's also a tie-in there. Imagine if this went on for half a year. Or in a sense, it does, but that's a different issue on campus. The other thing is that the Book of Esther is, of course, fiction, and in this fictional account of doings in ancient Persia, the final body count was dead Persians, 75,000 plus 300 plus 12, dead Jews, 0. So in the Bible, the Jews actually tend to do pretty well in that regard. In modern history, relative to the Arabs and the Muslims in their neighborhood, they also tend to do pretty well. I looked at the News Gazette this morning to find a kind of, piling on pretty thick in the wake of Netanyahu's speech. This was the second editorializing of the News Gazette editorial board in favor of Israel's concerns about being attacked by Iran. Should Iran get a nuclear weapon? It was accompanied on his extremely intensified editorial page with a cartoon to the same effect and a column by Charles Krauthammer to even worse effect, if that's possible. And I think it is because, Krauthammer believes wholeheartedly with both the biblical aspect of this and the modern aspect of it. I've been kind of fascinated by the kind of verbal tick that the News Gazette editors have in terms of their phrasing. They tend to use and by they I probably mean Jim Dye, they tend to use the phrase "no secret." Things tend to be no secret, and I don't know, we should get Lacan or something to analyze that. 4 times in this morning's editorial, the phrase "no secret" was used. In the very first sentence, President Barack Obama made no secret of his objections to Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress, et cetera, et cetera. Further down the page, if that's the way it's going to be, and Obama has made no secret of his preference to go around Congress, then Netanyahu was correct to cite 2 very big red flags. One being Iran's long history of not complying with international agreements and cannot be trusted, 2, permitting Iran to maintain its nuclear program, and putting a 10-year time limit on the agreement would leave it on the cusp of obtaining nuclear weapons complete with intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities that would pose a threat far beyond the Middle East. And of course, this is all just complete fantasy, complete nonsense. The third secret, but it's no secret, that economic sanctions imposed on Iran have exacted considerable pain on that country. That's actually true. Some things that are no secret, meaning that they're alleged to be obvious, really are obvious. And then finally, for the 4th time in this article, when the Israelis promise that never again, quote unquote, will they submit to the threat of destruction, they mean it. Given their history, meaning the history of the Jews, who can blame them for refusing to rely on the forbearance of enemies who make no secret of their genocidal intentions. Now we need, I don't know, I really don't know what to make of this, but it's like the use of the phrase "no secret" may be revealing something that's no secret about the News Gazette editors' regard for the facts and regard for what is obvious, and may be a way of saying that things that are untrue are in fact obvious, and that's just sort of highlighting that. Then again, maybe I'm making too much of this. Maybe a cigar is just a cigar. But in any event, it's strange to me as a Jewish person living in Urbana-Champaign, having for a few years after moving here, being affiliated with the local Jewish institutions, religious, secular, so forth. What to make of the Jewish response, especially locally, to these series of events globally and in Washington, and obviously some of them concerning the representatives from our state who are in Congress, in the Senate or the House. It seems to me that the Holocaust was a pretty serious business. And if there was going to be another Holocaust, and that was real, that we should be hearing from our local leaders that that is in fact the case. I mean, if I thought it was the case, I would be running naked down Green Street in the freezing weather, to emphasize that. And I would expect to have some company in doing that. But we don't hear a word from the local leadership of Sinai Temple, CU Jewish Federation, Hillel, the local rabbis, the local administrators, the local professors who are most identified with the Jewish community. I mean, it's pretty obvious that people don't want to talk about Netanyahu. They don't want to necessarily be identified with him. But the question is, if what he's saying is true, if Israel is under a mortal threat, you would hear more about it. But if it's not, why don't you hear that it's not? And I guess the short answer to that is that very few people have anything to gain by commenting on this issue. What is there? I mean, if someone is relatively in the good graces, is a member of the local synagogue or affiliated with the local Jewish institutions, there really is very little to be gained from pointing out that this might not be true. People will look at you with a blank stare. People may nod at you, but what is to be gained by pointing out that the person who allegedly represents, the entire history of the Jewish people and is trying to wrap the whole history of that into this object lesson regarding Iran, which of course has no regard for politics in this country, for politics in the Middle East, for the complicated relationships with Iran, with ISIS, with Israel, with Lebanon and Syria and all that. Anybody who has any regard for the complicated nature of any of this can't be happy with the scene that happened in Washington this week, but they have nothing to gain in terms of their own relationships around here with their ability to engage in any kind of activism one way or the other in doing so, because the people in Washington, the people who dictate these policies in a sense from Washington, from Israel itself, really don't care what people here think about that. They're happy for them to remain silent, and I think that's kind of a game that's being played, a game of passive consent, passive dissent, but certainly not any, again, as I've said repeatedly on this program, not any engaged conversation which could sort of help the Jewish community to begin to move forward, engaging some of these issues in a way that might actually be be helpful in terms of real issues of social justice.
Thank you, David. Karen, a response to the existential threats facing Israel from wherever they come?
I'm less concerned about the threats against Israel than I am about the threats against the world in general. As John Pilger's article pointed out, we really are on the cusp of a disaster, okay, likely to come from areas within the Ukraine, with our NATO buildup of nuclear weapons on Russia's borders, the provocations against Russia, and the fact that we're spreading some of this. Victoria Nuland, from what I understand, and her husband, Mr. Kagan, are quite active right now in Tajikistan. One of the stands, I'm sorry, I can't remember at the moment which one, but as far as Israel's being jeopardized by Iran, it's rather a joke, because Israel is a military power. I mean, they've got our bases and our nuclear weapons there on standby, although we have evidently allowed Israel to use them. We've given them permission to use them. Iran is not a military power. We know that Netanyahu actually lied to Congress in, 2012? And I think it's pretty clear he lied to them again. I just saw some of his speech to AIPAC on CNN, and I was so nauseous that I actually had to turn it off and try to avoid his speech to Congress. And then I watched one of our U.S. military advisors, not an advisor, he actually is a military person, on CNN this morning, briefly talking about how concerning it is that Iran is assisting the Iraqi military in Tikrit. And this somehow, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're being bombarded with propaganda about how we have to defeat ISIS. So there we have Iran
Right.
helping the Iraqi military defeat ISIS, and we don't like it. Why?
That's right.
Why? Because, he says, because Iran just wants to take over the territory and expand their territory and acquire their resources. All you have to do is look at a map and recognize that Iran is right next door. Yes, they don't want ISIS intruding on them. I think Iran is the only area right there that has not had ISIS intruding upon them because they've been fighting ISIS. Okay, but here we are worried about Iran taking over Iraq. So, I mean, to me, the propaganda, the duplicity, the lies that are forthcoming from all of these leaders, most especially our own, is so disturbing. I have to ask, where's it going to end? And I'm going to mention a book right now that I've been reading, Chris Hedges and Joe Sacco,
Oh, yes.
Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. And the final chapters, they talk a lot about Occupy movement against Wall Street. Goldman Sachs is like the #1 concern, the financial markets. They do predict that there will be a revolution. What we have to hope for is that it will be nonviolent. What we have to hope for is that it will not be taken over by these right-wing conservatives. I mean, unless the people rise up against what is happening, not just here, but over there. And that's one of the things that disturbs me, really, is the fact that while we do get information on what's happening in Ferguson, although it's somewhat perverted, or other parts of the country, we know what's happening, and we have protesters, we have demonstrations against a lot of these things. There's no one actively that I can actually see taking a leadership role and really fighting what's happening overseas, what's happening in the Ukraine. So I really have to ask the question, are enough people getting enough of the information about what's happening there? And that's why I think, Carl, as we were talking on Aware Tuesday, is that this article by John Pilger needs to be circulated so that people can really recognize where we're headed.
This is an article that was on the website, on the Facebook page for the News from Neptune by the Australian journalist John Pilger, who puts American war policy in the context, indeed, of American policy over the last generation or two, and talks about it as nothing more nor less than the return of fascism. Now, he's using fascism here to mean not just the sorts of governments that emerged in Europe after the First World War and in the context of the Great Depression, but of any aggressive military state that is producing war in the modern world. The connection between domestic and foreign policy is great. I think the head of the book that you just mentioned, Karen, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, concentrates primarily on what happens domestically,
Right. It's domestic
as a result of the government that we have at the moment.
Right.
But as you suggest, I think quite rightly, the two are clearly connected. And what we don't have in this country is any major political party saying so. What we have are two political parties that fight as factions. They look for advantage against one another, but they're both expressing neoliberal views, that is, views that redound to the credit of American business and the discredit of the social supports that have grown up since the Second World War. So they produce neoliberal view, and they produce neoconservative views, which are primarily views about the use of American military power abroad to control the world economy, which has been the position of the American government essentially since the Second World War, but becomes today an even more vicious assertion in the face of the development of the rest of the world. The sort of control that the U.S. had as the only undamaged country at the end of World War II is challenged by the resurgence of other societies around the world. And so what we have right now in America, as I think Karen was suggesting, is a government which purports to represent the liberal wing of one of those two parties, but in fact is carrying on an illegal war in the Middle East against a group called ISIS, provoking a war against Russia in the Ukraine, and is being urged to expand its war against all comers in the Middle East, specifically in regard to Iran. Now, this works, it seems to me, only when the government misleads substantially the American populace. When we are presented with this sort of shadow play of the Israeli prime minister and the president arguing over which one is going to have the right to say how American killing should be carried out. Today begins the news today, this morning began with an account of a letter sent by the Speaker of the House and a bipartisan committee of a dozen members of the Congress to President Obama, telling him that he really must get going on expanding the war in Ukraine. He really has got to send lethal weapons, interesting phrase, lethal weapons to the coup, to the junta in Kiev, a junta that the United States essentially put into place, so that it can attack the eastern region of its own country more efficiently than it's been doing so far. In fact, some 6,000 people have died, at least, as a result of the attack on the eastern region of Ukraine by the government that we put in place in Kiev. But that's not enough for the warmongers in the Congress. Unfortunately, the warmongers in the Congress don't have too many opponents. And the reason they don't have too many opponents is that the narrative, the story, the account is so badly misconceived, mispresented to most Americans. Americans have heard repeatedly that there's Russian aggression going on in Eastern Europe, and the question is Obama going to be man enough to stop it? Now, this is so far from, I mean, this is about on the level of saying to a German government in the 1930s that there's a Jewish plot against the German people, and will the government be strong enough to repel it? I mean, it's just that bad. And that's the sort of thing that leads the Australian journalist we referred to a moment ago, John Pilger, to talk about the revival of fascism in American foreign policy, and as this book points out, domestic policy as well. I don't think it's overstated. It's extremely dangerous, and it's scary. You're watching News from Neptune, where we try to talk about the misrepresentations that make up most of the news that most Americans hear. And we might point out, parenthetically, that Americans are the more deceived. That is to say, you can get a clearer story in other parts of the world. And in many other parts of the world, people look at America and wonder, how can those Americans be thinking what they do? And the answer is that we have the best controlled press in the world. The best controlled press in the world is a press that you don't see being controlled. And that's the way it works.
One of those places where people don't really get the story also is Israel itself. Certainly, Haaretz is a decent enough newspaper and provides some alternative perspectives. But a relatively small number of Israelis read that newspaper. And what goes on in Israel, and maybe most people watching this know this, is that Sheldon Adelson, who is a major funder of the Republican Party and a major, sort of a vetter of the, someone who will be vetting the upcoming, Republican presidential race, to see if the candidates are adequately subservient, actually publishes a newspaper in Israel, which is for free, which is basically, from what I understand, I've obviously never read it, but it basically is an advertisement, is a daily advertisement for the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu. Which is a million, however many hundreds of thousands or a million copies. This is what this is wall to wall what people are reading in Israel, and I've never really heard that their visual media have any alternative sources to that. Although obviously on the the internet, I'm sure the people there have access to alternative views, but. Outside of Israel and the United States, Carl, as you say, it's very different. Those are probably the two most intensely propagandized, effectively propagandized countries in the world. I've heard mentioned recently that Russia, there's very little alternative media in Russia, and that perhaps it might be different from the days of the Soviet Union, in which people understood that they were being lied to, and maybe now that's changed. I'm not sure about that, but that isn't necessarily any reason for us to falsely demonize Russia in relation to its intentions and interests in the Ukraine.
When it comes to elections, think there's any parallel between Bibi Netanyahu and Rahm Emanuel, other than the fact that they're both veterans of the Israeli armed forces?
Yeah, you mean what's going on in Chicago now?
Exactly.
Yeah, well,
this is two people who are expected to win. Who were expected to win their re-election easily, and maybe won't.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, I mean, what the opposition to Netanyahu is much less encouraging in its
good point.
In its actual enlightenment. I mean, there's no indication from what I've read that people opposing him have any different approach to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and Israel's general treatment of its neighbors. They may be a little less bellicose regarding Iran, but still, I mean, both in this. I mean, the positioning in this country nationally vis-a-vis Obama. I mean, this is all just playing politics regarding presenting Obama as somehow being undermining Israel, and that will redound probably to the advantage of Obama and the Democratic Party in any upcoming presidential race. I mean, most people at the in this national blue state, red state kind of thing that we've got going, people will see through that, but they won't be voting against supporting Israel, but they will be voting against some of the more genuinely lunatic views of the kind of people who spent 10 minutes out of Netanyahu's 40-minute talk cheering for
him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Take on this, Karen?
Well, I hope anyone who is able to vote in Chicago makes sure that they do so. And I understand you can do it. You can register online and overthrow this guy, Rahm Emanuel. Okay, we have, that's a domestic issue that voters can do something about. There is a peace movement in Israel, according to Jewish Voices for Peace. People in the thousands who came out against the desecration of Gaza, but they're really fighting an uphill battle, I gather. I don't know. I mean, I don't follow it that closely, and you can read Yuri Avneri's columns and Counterpunch, one of which is there this morning, and that's a long tradition of resistance to Israel's policies, especially since the '67 war. But there isn't much that I've seen that gives a whole lot of hope that there's any critical mass of movement within Israel to shift the political climate there towards anything which would create a genuine opportunity as Norman Finkelstein is always referring to, a peace along the lines of, or Chomsky himself referring to a peace along the lines of international law. It just doesn't seem to be in the cards. The settlers have become too numerous and too powerful, and the Russian support, the Russian Israeli support for the settlements, has become very powerful also. So, not much hope there for anything other than outside pressure and resistance from the Palestinians themselves.
And the question, once again, is the role of the United States, the policy of the United States, the policy of the United States government, what the United States government actually does. This is true, it seems to me, of all the really quite concerning war scenarios that we're facing in Southwest Asia in regard to ISIS, in East Europe in regard to Ukraine, and also in this question of Iran that has been bruited about so misleadingly in American politics in this last week or so. And it seems to me that for us as Americans, the issue always comes back to what the American government is actually doing. And this administration is, it seems to me, the champion since perhaps the Kennedy administration in misleading Americans on what it's doing, in lying. They really are better at it. The Obama administration is really better at it than the Nixon administration, than either of the Bush administrations, than even that great Southern prevaricator Lyndon Johnson was. They lie as a reflex, and they do it with sophistication in Washington these days, and therefore it's very difficult for Americans to try to see what our government is actually doing each of these things. The task is, as Noam Chomsky used to say, to provide yourself with weapons for intellectual self-defense, to get away from this immensely misleading account that we're getting from all sides in America, even though we congratulate ourselves on the freedom of our press. Yes, a very free press, all saying the same thing. And that's what we have to raise some serious questions about it. Now, I think the Obama administration has made as its principal move something that he learned on the basketball court. Fake left and drive right. pretend that you're doing something that's progressive and helpful, and then do something that in fact is in the interest of the American 1%, is the interest of the neoconservatives and the neoliberals who actually dominate his government. Fake left and drive right. And I think even the question of Israel and Iran is susceptible to that sort of analysis, that if we think about what the American government is doing in that regard, we begin to see a little bit about what's going on underneath the surface in this last week's conversation. The U.S. has, for years, pursued a policy of trying to control Middle East energy flows. That's our real interest in what goes on in the Middle East. Not Jews, not Arabs, not peace, not democracy. None of those things are primary in American concern. All of those things are part of a pyramid that rests upon the fundamental American concern that we, the United States, shall control what happens to the immense energy resources in the Middle East. And it's important we're talking about control here, not just access. It's not just that we want our hands on them. That has become clearer to more Americans recently with the coming of fracking and the ways in which oil resources are available to the United States. The United States has never been dependent on Middle East oil in any sense at all for domestic consumption. Most of our oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, from the Atlantic Basin, and fracking has just increased that. Now, what we're in fact dealing with in the Middle East is an attempt to try to control oil flows because the other advanced industrial economies all need that oil for one reason or another. And if the United States covers it, if the United States controls it, it has a chokehold on these other countries. For that reason, we don't really care who's in charge in the Middle East so long as they keep order and take orders. So we're perfectly happy with the exclusion of an ineffective dictator and his replacement by either a democratic regime, if such a thing should happen, or another dictator, so long as they can keep order and follow orders from Washington. Now, this is central enough to the American policy that it's nothing new that the Obama people have brought to Washington. What the Obama people have done is simply cover sin with smooth names, and more frequently made people think that we really have an argument about Iranian nuclear weapons, when in fact what we have an argument about is whether the United States is going to be able to get its various local satrapies, its various local clients in order when they have some disagreements among themselves. American control of the Middle East rests on an effective alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Because both these are the countries that offer America the basis for military control over oil flows in the region. The war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq by the United States in 2003, was dependent upon the fact that Iraq has the second largest reserves of petroleum in the Middle East. The attack on Gaddafi, the attack on Libya, put forward by the Clinton-Obama administration, to put not to put too fine a point on it, was concerned with the fact that Libya is a major oil producer, and we needed a government that was biddable in Libya. Gaddafi, who was nobody's dummy, understood that and showed up as biddable far too frequently for the many of his supporters in the Middle East, but nevertheless finally lost the mandate of heaven, lost the control from Washington, and as Hillary Clinton put it, we came, we saw, he died. That is, she promoted a war against this dictator because he was not succeeding, after many years of doing so, in the two requirements, keeping order and taking orders. American policy is straightforward. It's consistent. It doesn't change much from administration to administration, but the cover changes. And I think the Obama administration is, in fact, covering its activities perhaps far more effectively than any recent administration.
Did you care?
The only thing I would say is that we really have to be concerned with the Islamophobia that is sweeping most of Northern and Western Europe, and the anti-Semitism, which is sweeping the eastern portions of Europe. There's no question in my mind that, well, John Pilger had another article, this was back last summer, in which he was comparing Henry Kissinger and the bombing of Cambodia, one of the most nefarious bombings that ever took place, that we committed, and the rise of Pol Pot, with our bombing of the Middle East and the rise of ISIS. That the two are quite comparable and is damaging. I mean, Cambodia has never really recovered, but what's happening now in the Middle East is certainly of major concern, but also what's happening in the Ukraine and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And in the end, it's going to be the environment that's going to get us, because we're not doing anything about that. We're so focused on gaining resources, oil, minerals, et cetera, that we're going to lose the earth eventually, no matter what.
Islamophobia is an interesting topic as an example of the sort of cloud cuckoo land that goes on in American politics and the American domestic discussion of foreign policy. Republicans are having a wonderful time saying Obama's probably a Muslim because he won't step forward and condemn Islam as the source of problems in the Middle East. Well, you know, in fact, the administration, as usual, is playing a fairly deep game here. It's perfectly happy to use this popular understanding of Islam as the basis to support its war policy in the Middle East. At the same time, it doesn't really want to admit that some of its principal clients in the region are the most right-wing Islamic states, notably Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and that it has a concern for Islamic states in other parts of the world as well, most notably the world's largest Islamic state, Indonesia. And therefore, the Obama administration sits there and splits the difference. It says, oh, of course, we're not Islamophobic, you know. On the other hand, you know, if you all want to think that way and talk that way, you all go play. Works pretty well.
It just, I guess, at a different level, the concern, I'm trying to address some of the concerns you brought up before, Karen, just in terms of where we're at, where how we talk to people, where people's heads are at in regard to this. And I can't say I'm any great authority on that. I read enough of the mainstream media. I know that the whole tone of patriotism, especially since 9/11, especially at sporting events, which I do go to and watch occasionally, that all of these things enforce a kind of conformity and a kind of fear, and people have to wonder whether they're the only one in the room or in the arena or in the football stadium that might be looking at this a little bit differently and might not be going along with all of the taken for granted sentiments that go along with a pregame flag ceremony or the manner in which the Star Spangled Banner is presented in this hyper patriotic context. And that whole thing extends to schools. It extends to the kind of assumptions that we have in higher education about how we're all just doing the right thing and competing with the world, and let's not talk about all that stuff. How you can have somebody like a couple of years ago, like Norman Augustine, the former CEO of Lockheed Martin, coming to this campus to give a talk to advise us on the vision of the future. There are so many levels that people more or less quote unquote educated are so indoctrinated, and it's so difficult to find a space with which to begin a conversation about that would help people just everybody understands that in their own lives they have things they don't see well. They deny things. They deny things about themselves and their families and their friends. But at a very different level, we're denying something very obvious about our country and the role of our country in the world, and something that's been going on historically for as long as we've been a country. And so where do you begin to find a space where these things can be talked about? Not that they're not being talked about, but they can't, in a sort of polite conversation. People get together with like-minded people, and they're maybe free to say what they have to say. But how do you raise this issue in other contexts, which could kind of puncture this bubble and challenge some of these taboos about what can be said and not be said?
Well, I'm certainly not the person to answer that, because I've spent a lifetime of bringing up politics that were not necessarily popular. I was always the one at the sporting event or whatever asking the question as to what does this mean. Even when I was young, being told that, well, you'll never get married because you have to stop talking about politics. You're offending people too much. And I'm like, well, I don't care. That's me. What I do want to point out is that one of the issues we know, say in Chicago, for instance, is education, and the way that the attempt by the current government to privatize schools. Well, we know what that results in. When you do away with, and people think that, oh, you'll have better schools with the charter schools, etc. But it's about privatizing and delivering the messages of the corporate elite so that children are programmed at a very early age. But it goes, as you say, it goes beyond that. Control of our media. There are so many issues, there are so many concerns domestically that what I see happening is, okay, a lot of the issues, people are rising up and taking it on. And this is good because leadership develops through activism, and sometimes you can actually win on particular areas, say the Keystone pipeline. That's a very critical issue. It looks like we're going to win on that. But then what happens? Do people, because it's a particular personal concern, so do they then just go home? A lot of them do. The goal, of course, is that a lot of them won't, and a lot of them will continue their activism to take on other issues. Because at some point, unless we join together and recognize that there has to be significant change, and I'm at a complete loss here as to how we go about it, because, and that's one of the things I'm trying to enlighten myself about, because I think we are living on a precipice. I think we are facing nuclear war, given the provocations and the direction that we're taking. I think that unless people become more proactive, but that's not going to happen until, as you say, they're truly educated. Unless we do something, we really are facing extinction. That sounds pretty dire, and I know I'm always delivering the direst message, but I think this is what we're facing unless we're able somehow to link things up, which is what we attempt to do, is to link it up, not just domestic and international, but to link all of these issues up to recognize that there has to be a solution.
A couple of articles this last week in a couple of different places by political writers who are saying, look, let's face it, American democracy is finished. American democracy is over. It really doesn't make any difference what you convince the majority of the American people of, because the control of the government is in the hands of what was called almost a century ago the political class. That is about 20% of the population, usually those who've gone to good colleges, right? And that 20% has its minds thoroughly colonized into this account of American empire that puts up with the sorts of things that the Hedges book is talking about domestically, and is avid for military adventures abroad. That this is the group that is producing 2/3 of the Congress that cheered inordinately for the fantasies of the Prime Minister of Israel, and the folks who sent the president a letter afterwards saying, by the way, we got to go send weapons to kill Russians or Ukrainians, we don't really care which, because that's the part of the world in which we're promoting war. Now, when we've got a politics that works this way, it's kind of hard to see how you oppose it. We like to think, it's the reason we come in here and do programs like this, that talking about what is actually going on, exposing the lies of our rulers and so forth, will eventually be helpful because we can convince our fellow citizens that they are lies and that things can perhaps that way change. That may be right. But there are times when it looks like sort of a weak reed, and the notions are happy notions about American democracy and American popular sovereignty and so forth really are by the board. They really don't matter very much. What then is to be done, as someone once said?
Well, one of the things, I'm the person sitting here with my two colleagues, members of the executive committee of the local chapter of the Prairie Greens. We've just raised it from the ashes, so to speak, the local Green Party here in Champaign-Urbana, and I want to mention that Rich Whitney will be back here speaking at the Champaign Public Library, Room C, on March 14th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His topic will be focusing on the budget cuts that our Governor Ronner is proposing, and that is a topic of concern. But that the Green Party is, I think, the only alternative to the Democrats and the Republicans, and I think it's worth supporting. And I think this is one direction to take for those who believe in working within the system and utilizing our institutions. But I'm also very concerned that unless people are really proactive and rise up against the things that are happening, currently what we do not have a liberal elite who is sensitive to the masses. They are not sensitive to any of the concerns, and I think they're actually ludicrously insane the way they're going about provoking war, nuclear war at that. I don't know what's going on in their minds.
In terms of upcoming events, we also might mention that tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock in downtown Champaign, there will be the regular monthly demonstration by the local peace group AWARE. AWARE has been carrying on demonstrations against the war policy of the United States for almost a dozen years now. And so since those war policies are very much in place today, and that the U.S. is promoting war in Southwest Asia and Eastern Europe and elsewhere, it's worthwhile perhaps to say to our fellow citizens, this is what they're actually doing, although they don't admit it. This is what the government is actually doing, although they don't admit it, and they should be stopped.
One thing, just to stir up the pot even more, I know our director, Jason, recorded a meeting 2 Saturdays ago, which was testimony of local people being harassed by the cops, and some pretty telling stories. And one would only wonder how common those are, whether they're what the relationship is between the police harassment in a place like Ferguson and a place like Urbana or Champaign. And those are things that we should be finding out at the local level, because those are things that people can relate to. We're having a mayoral race in Champaign with a few candidates, a couple of whom were there actually at the, or I guess at least, 2 of the candidates were there at that meeting 2 weeks ago. But the question is, what can people do to at least find out what's going on and then make this a local issue? It's almost taken for granted that it doesn't matter who's mayor of Champaign for any of the issues that we've been talking about. And perhaps it doesn't at that level, but the question is, what can be done at the local level? What can be done to make a statement at the local level? For instance, Carl, a few weeks ago, you wrote a letter promoting the idea that police shouldn't carry guns. And
other countries get by with that.
Yeah. And I think that's a perfectly good idea. I think that's an idea that the Green Party ought to be putting forward, and that ought to be that would make a local campaign for mayor or whatever uh, uh, more relevant if there were issues like that on the table. But somehow, how can you even begin to talk about such a ludicrous idea as the fact that the cops would actually, we'd all be safer, they'd be safer if they didn't carry guns. So yeah.
And we should look on the fact that in countries essentially similar to the United States as far as economic development is concerned, the UK, Japan, Germany, which together have a population equivalent to the United States, the total number of fatalities by police shootings in recent years is a number usually in the low single digits, 2, 3, 4. We had another report this week that the FBI summaries of killings by police in America, which suggests killings between 200 and 400 American citizens by police, is low by 50%. So, I mean, we're dealing with a remarkably skewed American phenomenon. And it's interesting in some ways that there is not more discussion of that fact, because once again, in the old SDS maxim, everything is connected. American war policy abroad is bound up with its policing policy at home, not just that some of the same people are involved, as we found interestingly recently about Chicago police who ended up as torturers in Gitmo, but also in terms of the attitude, the assumptions, the substrate of the people who are involved in policing and military activities. The American sniper mentality, so to speak, is present apparently among the Chicago police as well, and the police of other American cities across the country. There was a reform police chief in New Haven, Connecticut, a number of years ago, who said quite candidly that his primary job was to keep suburban white adventure seekers off the police force. And he felt that, in fact, he hadn't managed to do that. So we're dealing with problems here which are connected in the way that the book that Karen mentioned earlier points out, Chris Hedges and Joe Sacco's Days of Destruction. It's a serious issue for us, even on the local level. One question about the mayoral candidates in Champaign, David. Were there any interesting differences amongst those candidates that came out at this meeting last week?
Oh, well, no, it wasn't really, that really wasn't the purpose of it. I mean, they were there to be good, to be good public servants and to take an interest in people that they don't really have much of an interest in and that aren't really going to be voting for them and they're not going to be too concerned about. But that's politics, So, I mean, I'm not disparaging them for that in and of itself. It's just that the whole tone of it is like, well, we can listen to you sympathetically while we're here, but what are we gonna do about this? And how are we gonna find out how serious this problem really is? It's good for some people to give testimony, to give anecdotal testimony, but very real testimony. But that has to be understood. This couldn't just be, they couldn't be isolated examples of this sort of thing happening. If it's happening to a couple of people who show up at this meeting, it's got to be happening to dozens or hundreds of people. And again, the question is, how much like Ferguson are we really in relationship to the harassment of minorities by the cops in terms of warrants, in terms of traffic, in terms of putting people into debt and getting them wrapped up in the system which they can't get out of and ruins their lives, which was the kind of stories we heard a couple weeks ago.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 10th week of 2015, a Purim costume party edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Aram and David Green. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4, with Neptuner David Johnson. And more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.